Start a new series, only 3 lessons this week, next week, and then the next. I know that this ice storm or snowstorm has spanned across several states. I know a lot whose services have been canceled because of inclement weather, so we have a lot more people viewing and participating online, so we're thankful very much for them. Living in a post-Christian culture and the state of the church. This lesson and next week are a little more on the negative side because we have to deal with some negative information before we get to the good stuff, being more on the positive side, and that will be the last lesson of this series. And so the religious landscape of America continues to change, and it's doing so at a steady pace. Granted, it's not going to change as fast here in the Bible Belt, where there are considerably more churches, and Christianity is very much more concentrated here in the Bible Belt than it is in other places of the U.S., especially regions like the Northeast, that, according to a recent survey, contains 8 of the top 10 post-Christian cities in the U.S. But I believe you can still see the change here, even where we live. Probably most noticeable in things like our politics, our media, perhaps even in some of our school systems. But there's an ongoing debate as whether or not America is, in fact, a post-Christian nation. But whether you can debate the reality of that or not, and maybe you can, what you can't debate is the reality of the statistics that we're going to look at just in a minute. Some statistics put out by groups like the Barna Group and the Pew Research Center. You've probably heard of them before, but very reputable companies as they look at the state of Christendom in the U.S. and even in some other places outside of the U.S. But there are a few decade-long studies done by both groups that reveal our country is rolling downhill towards becoming a post-Christian nation, if it isn't already. But I want to define what I mean by post-Christian nation. We could say a post-Christian nation is one in which the majority of citizens no longer identify as Christian. A post-Christian society is one that no longer sees the church as relevant or as a vital part of society, nor the Bible as authoritative or beneficial on a personal level. In a talk that was given, a man by the name John O'Sullivan, I think he gives a little more detailed answer, and he describes it this way. A post-Christian society is not merely a society in which agnosticism or atheism is the prevailing fundamental belief. It is a society rooted in the history, culture, and practices of Christianity, but in which the religious beliefs of Christianity have been either rejected or worse, forgotten. Now, you may say that doesn't describe us, and I would agree with you to some extent that it doesn't describe where we necessarily live, but you get outside of the Bible Belt, and it doesn't take you long to realize that this is very much a description of the society that a lot of people live in. Some might argue against the U.S. being a post-Christian nation, but let's look at the facts, and as we do that, I wanted to look at a few studies. And as we look at these, I'm asking you, please do not immediately dismiss them. I think the worst thing that we can do is dismiss what we're about to look at. And while it might not, we might not be able to change the church in America or America's perception of the church, what we can do is change the church here in Portland. What we can do is change our community's perception of the church, even more importantly, our community's perception of us. And even if it is an outstanding perception, we can do everything that we can to keep it that way or improve it. The Barna Group published the results of multiple surveys extending from 2000 to 2020. So we're looking at 20 years here, some even reaching further back than that. But the results were published in March 2020. So these are pre-pandemic statistics. The pandemic doesn't have anything to do with what we're about to look at, but we will look at some, I don't know if you can say post-pandemic, we're still in it, but some during pandemic statistics, I guess is the best way to say that. But first I want to define some terms. We're going to use a few terms: practicing Christians, non-practicing Christians, and then non-Christians. You probably know what I mean by that or what they mean by that, but I don't want to assume it. Practicing Christians identify as Christians. They agree strongly that faith is very important in their lives, and they attend church or worship services within the past month. I would say that describes probably everybody here in the room. Non-practicing Christians are those who identify, they would call themselves Christians, but they do not qualify as practicing Christians. In other words, they would say that my faith is not very important to me, and I have not attended a worship service in the last month or two, or perhaps even more than that. And then non-Christians are exactly what you would assume: U.S. adults who do not identify as a Christian. These numbers that we're about to look like are based on Christendom as a whole. So what I mean by that is they're not looking to a certain faith community as opposed to another faith community. This is everybody who identifies themselves as a Christian. So here are some pre-pandemic results, or data, I guess. In 2000, the results of these surveys said 45% of those sampled qualified as practicing Christians. This differentiates those who would say they're Christian but are not practicing. So this is just those who practice Christians. That share has consistently declined over the last 19 years, to the point that now just 25% of Americans identify themselves as practicing Christians. Now, where did they go? I'm glad you asked. The data indicates that the shift was very evenly split. Half of them fell away from consistent faith engagement, which means they became non-practicing Christians, and the other half moved into the non-Christian segment, and that shift contributed to the growth of those that were either agnostic, atheist, or considered themselves nothing, which that group is called nones, N-O-N-E, not N-U-N, which means they just say, I'm nothing. I'm not this, I'm not that. I just consider myself to be nothing. And so those that fell away split evenly into the nothing group, or atheist or agnostic, and then into the non-practicing Christians, although they would still identify themselves as a Christian. This shift is made even clearer when we look at attendance. This study goes all the way back to 1993. 36% fewer Americans attended church weekly in 2020 than they did in 1993. The decline is across the board with all age groups, fairly even. Millennials, Generation X, Boomers, the elders all saw a decrease, with the steepest decrease of 14% among the elders, or the oldest group. And some of that was attributed to sickness and maybe not being able to get out as often as they would like. But from 2011 to 2019, the percentage of young adults, those in the category of 18 to 29-year-olds, who have dropped out of the church, increased from 59% to 64%. But there is hope. There is a group, according to this survey, that has been labeled resilient disciples, who are in this age group, 18 to 29, who, in spite of maybe some tension that they feel in the church and everyday life, they keep showing up to services. They keep showing up to Bible class and to worship, and I'm thankful for that. Fun fact, as Sam often says, when it comes to attendance, faithful attendance, I think it was about a decade ago, was defined as attending a worship service 3 to 4 times a week. Now faithful church attendance is defined as attending 3 to 4 times a month. Let that sink in for just a little bit. Consistency in Bible reading, thankfully, has remained steady for nearly a decade. In 2020, 35% of people surveyed read their Bible at least once in the past 7 days. That number was 34% in 1993, so it increased a percent. In 1999, 12% of people read their Bible every day, as opposed to 21% who did not read their Bible at all. And then we moved to 2019, and 14% of people read their Bible every day, while 35% of people did not read the Bible at all. I don't know if that means they don't own one. I find that hard to believe, but it just finds that they see it as not being relevant in their life and not being able to give them guidance in the things that they face. Thankfully, though, a majority of Americans still pray. In 1996, 83% prayed at least once a week. In 2020, that number dropped, but it's still a majority at 69% prayed at least once a week. I was particularly interested, and maybe you will be too, in what the survey reveals about the relevancy of the church. The church, understand this, will always be relevant. The Lord's church will always be relevant so as she is doing what she was divinely designed and appointed to do, whether the culture, society, or others perceive that she is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. But 94% of practicing Christians agree the church is having a positive, or a very positive or somewhat positive impact on the community. It makes sense that we would see ourselves that way. But only 43% of non-Christians agree the church is having a very positive or somewhat positive impact on their community. And really, that's ought to be who we're asking and who we're finding this information out from. 20% of practicing Christians believe the church is definitely to somewhat not relevant in today's world. I find that very interesting, that there is a percentage of practicing Christians who believe that the church they attend, or the church as a whole, is not relevant, but they keep going. 52% of non-Christians believe the church is definitely to somewhat not relevant in today's world. I think that's one reason we're having such a hard time of reaching and converting the lost to Christ. Those are the pre-pandemic. Now, during the pandemic, there are 3 categories surveyed here: all adults, churched adults, and practicing Christians. And the difference between practicing Christians and church adults, again, is the idea of one attends more than the other, or one does not attend at all. And so when they were asked the question, during the COVID-19 pandemic, on average, how often have you attended a church worship service, either in person or digitally? That is, either online or maybe through the phone or maybe listening somehow, but you couldn't see it. And so we're not saying didn't attend, but you attended one or the other. And here's where it gets interesting. In 2019, only 14% of all adults said they never went to church. That's the idea of never going to worship. In 2020, that number jumped to 53%. That's almost 40% jump in less than 12 months. In 2019, 100% of practicing Christians and church adults had gone to church within the past 6 months. 6 months into the pandemic, 19% of practicing Christians and 22% of church adults hadn't gone to church at all. That's either virtually or in person. That's a big jump. That's a real big jump. And it's a reason for concern. It's a reason to stop and think and to look at ourselves and to evaluate and do some self-reflection. But I think the big takeaway is 1 out of 5 churchgoers, 20%, have simply stopped attending all forms of worship in 2020. Now, we could argue that and go, well, we've made it easy, we've done this, we've done that. And I'm not saying there's not any truth to that. But what we have to stop thinking about this idea of going back to normal. Nothing in the data suggests that we will ever be back to normal. Things will not be normal again. The church has changed dramatically and for good in many instances. This church, Portland Church of Christ, we're not the same church that we were before the pandemic. We're very different than what we were. And I think you would agree with that. The COVID pandemic seems to have sped up the trip that we're taking towards being a post-Christian society or culture. And the church increasingly has sped up this concept that we are increasingly being seen or treated as irrelevant. Even, the studies show, by her own members. That's cause for concern. So what does it mean? Well, what do the numbers mean? Here's what the analysts, those that looked at this, that did these surveys, collected it all back, and over the past 20 years they've been looking at this. Here's what they say. They said the big takeaway is committed Christians are not the ones who are moving away from faith communities. Instead, those who are marginally attached to their faith are the ones abandoning the church. I think there's a lot of truth to that. A whole lot of truth to that. And I think one thing that we need to learn from it is that engagement is key. Engagement is the golden egg to some extent. Church leaders across the board, not just here, but across the board, church leaders have to figure out how to engage all age demographics and provide avenues for us to live out our faith in Jesus or risk losing the church that they will one day have to give an account to the chief shepherd. It's plain and simple. That's what it is. For the most part, what the surveys reveal is we have become a group of attenders. James calls that hearers only and not doers of the word. That's what the surveys reveal. That's what the information is showing. Whether we would agree with that or not, that is what the facts are showing. The church is a living, breathing organism, an organism that receives her life from Jesus, who the Bible says, Colossians chapter 1 and verse 18, is the head of the body, the church. And as a living organism, we have to change and adapt. Now, listen to what I mean by this. Because my experience is, when you say change and adapt in a group of Church of Christ members, the knee-jerk reaction is to bristle, clench your jaw, roll up your fist, and say those are fighting words. I'm not saying we're changing the gospel. I'm not saying we change truth. I'm not saying we compromise anything that God has revealed to us. That's not what we need to do. But what we do need to do is perk our ears up and pay attention to the outside world and see how can we emphasize the mission of the church over the method of the church. Because let's face it, our methods are not working. But we still have a mission. The gospel still needs to be taught. The lost still need to hear it. There are people that still need Jesus. And so we've got to be innovative and find ways to reach them with the gospel. It's the same gospel. All we have to do, though, is figure out ways to wrap it in a different way to present it to them. That's what needs to be done. We have to change and adapt. Because if we don't, we're going to keep losing fringe members because we're not engaging them. We've got to look for ways to engage our members. That is y'all, us, together. Because you could probably name several people, even 2 handfuls of people, that you only see once or twice a month, even before the pandemic. And now you don't see them at all. find ways of engaging, finding ways to change and to adapt so that we can still fulfill the mission of Christ and be faithful to Him. Open up to Revelation chapter 3. In Revelation chapter 2 and 3, we find the 7 churches of Asia. In chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, in particular, is the church at Sardis. And I feel in many ways that this church parallels a lot of the findings of the Barna Group and the Pew Research Center. And so that's why I chose this one this morning. The Bible says, or Jesus says, "And to the angel of the church in Sardis write, the words of Him who has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars." In other words, He says, I'm the one, if you go back to Revelation chapter 1, I'm the one that holds you in my hand. I'm the one that gives you life. I'm the one that you are to look to in all things. I know your works. You have the reputation of being alive, but you are dead. You think one thing, Jesus says, I see another. Wake up. Strengthen what remains and is about to die, for I have not found your works complete in the sight of my God. It doesn't mean that everything's wrong. It doesn't mean that they're not doing some good things and some right things. He says, but you've got work to do. Remember then what you received and heard. Keep it and repent. If you will not wake up, if you will not adapt and change, He says, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what hour I will come against you. Yet you have still a few names in Sardis, people who have not soiled their garments, and they will walk with me in white, for they are worthy. In other words, everyone else still has the opportunity to make some changes, and so that they can be part of this group. The one who overcomes or conquers will be clothed thus in white garments, and I will never blot his name out of the book of life. I will confess his name before my Father and before His angels. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Jesus ends every letter with that. It's the idea of listen up. Listen up. What I'm saying here is not fluff. I'm not saying this to listen to myself talk. I'm saying these things because this is what you as a church needs to hear, and you need to not just hear it. Now you need to be doers of it. You need to engage in this. And if there are changes that need to be made, you need to make those changes. If you're asleep, you're not paying attention, you need to wake up. If you're weak, you need to strengthen yourselves. Because you have a reputation that you're alive, but I see something very different. And it wasn't the community's idea of Sardis that mattered. It was what Jesus saw. And He says, you're dead. Jesus tells them they better make some changes or they will cease to exist. Church, when you leave these 4 walls in a few minutes, although the sun is shining, it looks like, you're walking out into darkness. You're walking out into a very dark and depraved world. A world that doesn't know up from down and left to right, what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's evil, what's righteous, what's unrighteous, what is godly and what's not. And we have been commissioned to be light in the world. Jesus is calling us, the Portland Church of Christ, as He did to the Philippian church, as Paul writes to them, do all things without grumbling or disputing. Don't walk out of here in a dark world and go, oh, it's just so terrible. What's this world coming to? And you could make a list of it. He says, do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. That word lights can be very easily translated stars. When you look up at night and the sky is dark, what do you see? The stars shining. And that's what the world ought to see in us. When Portland, the city of Portland looks at us and they see darkness everywhere else, but they look at us and they see stars shining. They see something good. And when you see a light in a dark place, what do you want to do? You naturally want to gravitate towards that. You want to walk towards it. You want to go to it because it's a symbol of hope and life. That's what we need to be. That's what we need to work to be. We need to look at ourselves and honestly ask, are we being that to the world? He calls us to thrive in a post-Christian culture in the same way that the very first century Christians did in a pre-Christian culture. Are we doing it? The first century church, if it can turn a pre-Christian culture, pagan culture, upside down, what do you think the Spirit can do with us here in Portland? Just the city of Portland. But before we discuss what we need to do, next week we're going to look at how did we get here? How did we get to this place where 20% of Christians who were attending before the pandemic are now not attending at all? How do we get to the point where numbers and our relevancy in the community are going down? How did we get to that point? Next week, I'm going to share with you at least some of my thoughts and how we got there. And then after that, we're going to go on the upside of that and be much more positive as we look to what we can do or how we can make some changes. This morning, I appreciate you being here. I appreciate your attendance. I appreciate your love for God and His Word and for one another. It says a lot for you being here and braving some of the elements. And I appreciate that very much. I know your shepherds do too. And I hope and I pray that you've been encouraged this morning. But maybe there's a need. Maybe you have a need. Maybe God's been stirring something in you. Maybe the Spirit's been setting something on your heart that you just need to work through and confess, maybe make right with God or make right with somebody else. And we encourage you to do that this morning. Or maybe you're not a child of God yet and you realize that you're lost without Jesus in your life and you're ready to make Him number one to the exclusion of everything and everybody else. You can do that this morning by repenting of your sins and being immersed into Jesus for the forgiveness of those sins and being raised to walk a life immersed into Jesus, abiding in Him, that you may bear fruit for Him and His church. Whatever your need is, we encourage you to come forward while we stand and while we sing.